The night had gone quiet in the way that only corporate towers know how, that peculiar, pressurized silence where the hum of ventilation systems replaces the noise of 300 employees, where the glow of monitors casts long shadows across empty cubicles, and where the truth about people tends to reveal itself in ways that daylight never allows. Eleanor Gray sat behind her desk on the 42nd floor of Gray Holdings headquarters. Her dark hair pinned back, her posture deliberately relaxed, her eyes closed just enough to pass as sleep. She had done this before. More times than she cared to count, she had arranged herself at her desk near midnight and waited to see who remained in the building, and more importantly, what they chose to do when they believed no one of consequence was watching. The results had never surprised her. Not really. A junior executive rifling through papers on a colleague's desk, a department head sending himself files from the server, a manager bad-mouthing her name into a phone on the other side of the glass wall. Every test confirmed what Eleanor had long since accepted as the fundamental operating principle of her world. When the powerful close their eyes, the opportunistic get to work. She had grown so accustomed to disappointment that she had stopped expecting anything else. But on this particular night, in the 43rd month of running her father's company alone, something happened that Eleanor Gray was entirely unprepared for, and it would unravel every certainty she had built around herself, like armor. Eleanor Celeste Gray had been 32 years old when her father, William Gray, died of a sudden cardiac event in the back of a town car on his way to a board meeting. She had been sitting in her own office 3 floors below his when her phone rang. By the time she reached the hospital, he was already gone. What followed was not grief in any form she recognized from movies or literature. It was something colder, more administrative. There were lawyers and trustees and a company worth $4.7 billion that needed a leader immediately. And Eleanor, who had been working at Gray Holdings since she was 24, who had watched and absorbed and prepared herself in 100 quiet ways for exactly this moment, stepped into the role before the flowers at the funeral had wilted. People called her composed, they called her brilliant, they called her ruthless, though never to her face. What they did not call her was lonely, because loneliness implies a vacancy the person is aware of and mourns, and Eleanor had become so skilled at filling her interior life with work that she had convinced herself there was nothing missing. Her childhood had been gilded and loveless in equal measure, a father who expressed affection through acquisition, who believed that the right school and the right clothes and the right address constituted a form of love that required no further elaboration, and a mother who left when Eleanor was 9 and sent birthday cards from a different time zone until she stopped sending those, too. Eleanor had stood at the window of their Connecticut estate and watched her mother's taxi pull down the gravel drive and had decided, in the wordless but absolute way that 9-year-olds decide things, that she would not be undone by it. She had kept that promise to herself with remarkable consistency for the next 26 years. She had grown up surrounded by housekeepers and tutors and every material comfort available, and she had learned early that people who wanted something from you were far more reliable than people who claimed to want nothing at all. At least the former were honest about their intentions. The ones who claimed they loved you without condition were the ones who eventually showed you exactly what their condition was. A business partner, who had been her father's closest friend for 20 years, had attempted to dissolve her authority over the company in the first 6 months after William's death, citing her age and gender in a closed-door meeting he did not know she had recorded. A man she had dated for 14 months, who had spoken about the future in a way that made her cautiously hopeful, had accepted a position at a rival firm and taken with him a strategic analysis she had shared in confidence. A woman she had considered her only real friend since college had written an anonymous profile piece for a business magazine that described Eleanor as pathologically incapable of emotional generosity. She had recognized the source within the first paragraph. After that, Eleanor had refined and systematized her distrust the way other people refined a business model. She removed the variables that could hurt her. She controlled what she could and accepted what she couldn't. She kept her circles small and her expectations smaller. And she developed her late-night tests, not because she enjoyed surveillance, but because she needed, at some fundamental level, to keep finding proof that her worldview was correct. Proof was safe. Proof didn't leave. The man who would destroy that proof entirely was named Jason Price, and he was 38 years old, and he had been mopping the hallway outside the executive floor for the past 4 months, without once being acknowledged by name by anyone above the rank of administrative assistant. He was tall in a way that seemed reluctant, as though height had been granted to him without his full consent, and he moved through the corridors of Gray Holdings with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned to be invisible, not because he wants to be, but because invisibility is the professional expectation of people who clean up after others for a living. He wore a gray uniform that fit him poorly across the shoulders, slightly too narrow for a man who had once spent his days in an engineering facility, lifting equipment and solving structural problems for one of the largest manufacturing firms in the state. He had a face that had been handsome once and was still striking in a weathered way, not the kind of weathering that comes from vanity neglected, but the kind that comes from years of caring about something more important than appearances. He had dark eyes that were attentive even when the rest of him was still, and a habit of pausing in doorways as though doing a quick mental inventory before entering any room, a reflex left over from the engineering floor, where situational awareness was the difference between a safe day and an accident report. He had been a careful man his whole life, and careful men, he had come to understand, were not necessarily protected from catastrophe. They were simply better at surviving it. Jason Price had been married to a woman named Diane for 9 years. Diane had been funny and stubborn and deeply principled, a high school art teacher who could hold 4 different conversations simultaneously, and who had a talent for making their small house feel like the largest, warmest place in any city. When their daughter Lily was born, she was born into a household that was not wealthy but was genuinely, structurally happy, the kind of happiness that has been built through small, consistent choices rather than dramatic declarations. Lily was 2 years old when Diane began having headaches that she attributed to stress. She was 3 when the diagnosis came. A rare and aggressive form of brain cancer. The kind that the oncologists described in the careful, measured language of people delivering sentences. Jason had stood in that office and nodded, and asked every question he could think of, and then gone to his car and sat in the parking structure for 40 minutes before he felt capable of driving. He had not cried then, or not much. He had understood immediately that crying was a luxury he could not currently afford. There was Lily, who was 3 and did not understand what was happening. And there was Diane, who understood everything and was trying very hard to be brave. And there was Jason, who had decided in that parking structure that his entire life, for the foreseeable future, would be organized around one single objective, giving Diane every available chance. He sold their house and used the equity to cover the first round of experimental treatment costs that their insurance classified as elective. He took a second job. He negotiated with hospitals and billing departments in the way he had once negotiated with subcontractors methodically. Without ego, looking for any opening that presented itself, he moved them into a 2-bedroom apartment in a building that had seen better decades. And he told Lily they were going on an adventure. And Lily, being 3, believed him completely, because children that age still grant the adults they love the benefit of every doubt. Diane fought for 2 years. She was 34 years old when she died on a Thursday morning in March, with Jason holding one hand and Lily, who was 5 and solemn, holding the other. The hospital room had a window that faced east, and the light coming through it was the pale, uncomplicated gold of early spring. And Jason had thought, in the strange, dissociated clarity of that moment, that it was an indecent amount of beauty for such a terrible morning. He had kept that thought to himself, along with most of his grief, for the 3 years that followed. The debt Diane's illness had generated was not ruinous in the abstract sense of the word. Jason made his payments. He didn't miss rent. He kept the lights on. But it was ruinous in the way that mattered more, which is that it eliminated every margin for error, every cushion against the ordinary disasters of a working life, and it kept him in a permanent posture of vigilance that was exhausting in ways he had no one to describe to. He lost his engineering position not because of incompetence, but because the firm he worked for was acquired and restructured, and the restructuring eliminated his department in the name of efficiency, and Jason was left, at 36, with a mechanical engineering degree, 6 years of solid industry experience, a 6-year-old daughter, and a job market that had moved significantly in the time he had been occupied with keeping his family together. He found work where he could find it: handyman calls, delivery routes, a part-time position at a hardware warehouse, and then, 8 months ago, the night cleaning contract at Gray Holdings, which paid better than most of the other work and offered consistent hours, which mattered enormously when you had a daughter who needed to be at school by 7:45 and picked up by 3:15 and fed something nutritious at some point in between. His neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Ellison, who had taken a grandmotherly interest in Lily, watched the girl on the nights Jason worked late. It was not a perfect arrangement. No arrangement available to Jason Price at this point in his life was perfect, but it was workable, and workable was what he had. On the night that would change everything, Jason had finished the East Wing offices and was working his way toward the executive floor, which was always his last stop. He preferred it that way. The executive floor made him feel something he couldn't quite name, not resentment, not exactly, though there was an element of that in the vicinity. More like a kind of philosophical vertigo, the experience of being in spaces designed specifically to impress upon the people who used them that they occupied a different category of existence than everyone else. The furniture alone on the 42nd floor cost more than Jason earned in a year. He had calculated this once, idly, while polishing the conference room table, and then stopped calculating because it was not a productive exercise. He pushed his cart through the corridor and turned toward the CEO's office and noticed, through the glass partition, that the light was still on. This was not unusual. Eleanor Gray worked late with regularity. He had seen evidence of this many times, though he had never seen her directly. What was unusual was the figure slumped over the large desk, hair loose around her shoulders, one arm crooked beneath her head, clearly asleep. Jason stopped in the doorway. He looked at the woman for a moment. He had no idea who she was. Exactly, he knew, in the general way that building staff know things, that the CEO of Gray Holdings was a woman. But he had never connected that abstract fact to a specific face. And the woman at the desk was not connected, in his mind, to any idea of power or authority. She was simply a person who had fallen asleep at work, which was something he understood completely, having done it himself more times than he could count in the years of Diane's illness, grabbed 20-minute intervals of unconsciousness wherever they presented themselves. He stood in the doorway and took stock of the situation with his engineer's habit of rapid environmental assessment. The air conditioning unit on the wall was set to 68 degrees, which was appropriate for daytime, but not for someone asleep and still. The woman's blazer was draped over the back of her chair, and she was in a thin blouse, and her neck was bent at an angle that would produce serious stiffness within the hour. There was a half-empty glass of water on the edge of the desk that had gone warm. The overhead lights were at full brightness, which was unnecessary and would, he knew from his own experience, make waking up feel more abrupt and disorienting than it needed to. Jason considered the situation. He was a janitor. He had a cart in the hallway and a floor to finish, and a woman who did not know he existed asleep at her desk. The sensible thing, the professional thing, the thing that would involve the least complication, was to clean around the office quietly and move on. He knew this. He had spent 3 years becoming very good at moving on from things that were not his business to address. Something about the visible fatigue in even her sleeping posture that made moving on feel like a small, specific act of unkindness that he was not willing to commit. He had been the recipient of too many such small unkindnesses. In recent years, the landlord who raised the rent without notice, the insurance company representative who spoke to him in the polite, impersonal tone of someone reading from a card, and he had developed a perhaps impractical sensitivity to their significance. He unzipped his work jacket. It was an old thing, a dark blue canvas utility jacket he had bought 5 years ago at a warehouse sale. The kind with deep pockets and a lining that had gone slightly rough with washing. It was not a fine garment. The elbows were worn through to a lighter shade, and one of the zipper pulls had been replaced with a safety pin, and it smelled of industrial cleaning solution and something fainter beneath that, a combination of sawdust and cold air that was simply the smell of his daily life. He folded it carefully and crossed the room in 3 quiet steps and placed it over the sleeping woman's shoulders. draping it so that the collar sat gently at the back of her neck and the weight of it covered her upper arms. Then he went back to the cart, filled a clean cup from the small sink in the adjacent kitchen alcove, and set it on the desk beside her mouse, not too close to the edge, not close enough to knock over an elbow, waking up startled. He turned the overhead lights off and left the single desk lamp burning, which was enough light to navigate the room without being enough to disturb a sleeper. He completed his cleaning of the office in near silence, moving the way he moved when Lily was asleep and he was tidying around her. Careful, habitual, efficient, the quiet competence of someone who has learned to take care of things without making a production of it. When he was done, he wheeled his cart back into the corridor and continued to the next office. And he did not think about the sleeping woman again, or not much, because there was still the north corridor to finish and Mrs. Ellison was watching Lily, and he needed to be home before 6. Eleanor Gray had not been asleep. She had been watching through lowered lashes from the moment Jason appeared in the doorway, and she had watched every movement he made with a focus that she could not have explained and did not attempt to. She felt the jacket settle over her shoulders, felt the weight of it, the roughness of the lining, the faint traces of a life lived in practical circumstances, and she kept perfectly still. She heard the soft sound of water running in the kitchen alcove. She heard the cup placed gently on the desk. She heard the lights go out, and the room settle into its gentler, lamp-lit dimension. She kept her eyes closed until she heard his cart move away down the corridor, and then she waited another 2 full minutes before she lifted her head. The jacket slid slightly as she sat up and she caught it with both hands and held it in her lap and looked at it in the lamplight. It was worn through at the elbows. There was a safety pin where a zipper pull had presumably given out. There was a small stain on the left cuff that had been scrubbed at and faded, but not entirely removed. It was, by any material measure, a worthless piece of clothing. And Eleanor Gray, who owned a penthouse apartment and 4 investment properties and a wardrobe of items that collectively cost more than most people's cars, sat at her desk at midnight and held this jacket in both hands and felt something move through her chest that she had not felt in so long that she spent several disoriented seconds trying to identify it. It was not gratitude, exactly. It was not sentimentality. It was something more primitive and more disturbing than either of those. It was the feeling of having been seen and tended to by someone who wanted nothing in return, and the feeling was so unfamiliar that her first response to it, sitting alone in her lamp-lit office, was to cry. She pulled the security footage that night. She sat at her desk with the jacket still over her shoulders and watched the recording from the 3 cameras covering the executive corridor and her office. And she watched Jason Price cross her threshold with that careful, assessing pause, and she watched him look at her and make a decision. And she watched the decision unfold in real time, the jacket, the water, the lights, and she played it back twice, and then a third time, paying attention to different things each time. His face, when it was visible, showed no performance. There was no glance toward the camera. There was no hesitation that suggested calculation. He moved with the uncomplicated directness of a person doing what seemed obviously necessary, without apparent awareness that obviousness and necessity might not be sufficient justifications in every context. Eleanor sat with the footage, and her cold water, and her borrowed jacket until 3 in the morning, when the cleaning crew finished the building, and the last service elevator hummed its way back to the ground floor, and during those 3 hours, she dismantled and re-examined every assumption she had built her emotional life around, with the same methodical attention she brought to a balance sheet that wasn't adding up. By the time she finally went home, she had not resolved anything, but she had the name on the building access log. Jason Price. Contract staff. Night cleaning division. And she intended to learn more. The investigation she ran was discreet and thorough, because Eleanor did not know how to be thorough without also being discreet. Her assistant, a capable young woman named Patricia, who had worked for her for 3 years and knew better than to ask why about anything, compiled a file within 48 hours. The file contained Jason Price's employment history, and it was not what Eleanor had expected. She had anticipated, and she recognized, with some discomfort, the classism inherent in the anticipation, a history consistent with janitorial work, a series of similar positions, perhaps some gaps, perhaps a record of instability. What she found instead was a man who had spent 6 years as a mechanical engineer at Garrett Industrial Solutions, where his performance reviews described him as exceptional, meticulous, and unusually collaborative for someone with his level of technical ability. He had been on a promotion track that colleagues, reached by Patricia through careful, anonymous means, described as accelerated. He had patents pending on 2 equipment modifications that had increased production efficiency on Garrett's main floor by 11%. He had been, by any professional measure, a man building something solid and real. And then Diane had gotten sick, and the building had stopped. Eleanor read the file twice, then closed it and went to her window and looked at the city below, which was doing what cities do in the early afternoon, which is move and pulse and operate according to its own logic, without reference to any individual suffering occurring within it. She thought about Lily, whose elementary school records Patricia had been able to access only briefly, and had described the girl as performing above grade level with a particular gift for reading. She thought about a man who had sold his house and his professional life to try to keep his wife alive, and who had then gone to work mopping floors without, as far as she could determine from any available evidence, having told anyone that he was doing so because every other option had been exhausted. She thought about the jacket with the safety pin. She asked Patricia to find out where he lived. She drove there on a Saturday, in her own car rather than the company car, wearing clothes that she thought approximated unremarkability, dark jeans, a plain coat, no jewelry, and she parked across the street from the address Patricia had provided, and sat in the car for 10 minutes before she acknowledged what she was doing, which was something she had never done before in her adult life. She was seeking out a specific person not because of what that person could do for her, but because she could not stop thinking about them. The building was a walk-up on a street that was not dangerous, but was clearly underfunded. The sidewalk had buckled in several places and not been repaired, and the building's facade had that particular look of deferred maintenance that results not from neglect, but from insufficient resources for anything beyond the essential. She watched the entrance for a while, and then Jason emerged with Lily, who was 8 years old and small for her age, and was wearing a bright yellow coat that was several sizes too large, clearly bought with room to grow into, and was dragging a backpack shaped like a turtle that seemed to be a significant source of satisfaction to her. She was talking at some length and with evident enthusiasm about something Jason appeared to be genuinely engaged with, nodding and asking follow-up questions that Eleanor, from across the street, could not hear but could read in the shape of his posture leaning slightly toward his daughter, giving her the weight of his full attention. The way parents do, when they understand that childhood narratives, however meandering, are the foundation of something a child is building and needs witnessed. They went around the corner to a small park, and Eleanor followed at a distance that felt, even to her, slightly absurd for a woman of her position, but she could not make herself leave. She watched them from a bench on the opposite side of the park, behind a newspaper she had thought to bring. She watched Jason push Lily on a swing, while simultaneously managing a phone call he seemed to find frustrating, running one hand through his hair in a gesture of contained exasperation, while keeping the other on the chain of the swing, maintaining the rhythm. She watched Lily jump from the swing at its apex and land running, stumble, get up, report on her condition fine, clearly fine, and race toward the small climbing structure. She watched Jason end the phone call and put the phone in his pocket, and watch his daughter climb with an expression that was so purely composed of love and exhaustion, and something that might have been contentment despite everything. That Eleanor felt the observation of it as a physical thing, a pressure behind her sternum. Later, walking back to the building, Lily reached up and took Jason's hand, and he squeezed it, and Lily said something that made Jason laugh, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that involves the whole face, and Eleanor sat on her bench and did not look at her newspaper at all. She understood more when she went home. She understood that she had been watching someone live a life with the same raw material that she had always used to construct distance loss, disappointment, the particular difficulty of caring for others when your own resources are depleted, and had produced something fundamentally different from what she had produced. She had produced systems and tests and controlled environments, and an apartment that had been professionally designed to be beautiful, and that contained, as far as she could determine on the drive home, no single thing that had been chosen purely for comfort. Jason Price had produced a yellow coat, 2 sizes too large, and a laugh that was entirely real, and a child who grabbed his hand on the sidewalk with complete confidence that it would be there. Eleanor did not know what to do with this information. She was not accustomed to not knowing what to do. She went to work on Monday and told Patricia nothing. The conversations began naturally, or in a form that Eleanor designed to feel natural, which was perhaps the same thing in her case. She started being present when Jason arrived for his shift, nothing conspicuous, just still at her desk rather than having already left. She said good evening when he appeared in the corridor. He said good evening back with the slightly formal courtesy of someone who is surprised to be addressed directly but does not want to show it. She asked, one evening, whether he'd had a good weekend, and he said yes. He and his daughter had gone to the park, and she said that sounded nice, and meant it so completely that she was briefly afraid it showed. Over the following weeks she found small, plausible reasons to extend these exchanges. A question about the building's climate control, which he answered with more detailed technical understanding than she had expected. A comment about a news story she had been following. He was not effusive, and he was not trying to impress her. He spoke the way people speak when they have no particular agenda, which was, in Eleanor's experience, so rare as to be almost disorienting. He thought she was a senior manager. She let him think this, not because she planned to deceive him indefinitely, but because she was not ready for the complication that came with the alternative. She told him, one evening, that she had recently had the odd experience of not being sure whether the people around her were being honest with her, and without going into detail, she described the feeling of it, the exhaustion of constant interpretation, the way you started to hear every statement as a potential strategy. He was quiet for a moment. And then he said, simply, that he understood, though not from the same angle. He said that the hardest part of losing his wife had not been the grief itself, but the discovery that grief makes certain people uncomfortable enough that they perform a version of sympathy that is really about their own discomfort, and after a while you learn to distinguish the performance from the real thing, and then you start to wonder which category you fall into yourself. Eleanor had not expected that degree of self-awareness, or that degree of openness, from someone she had first observed through a security camera, and she found, to her considerable surprise, that she had nothing useful to say in response, because it was true, and because it was honest, and because she was not in the habit of receiving either of those things without deflecting them. She thanked him for saying it. He looked faintly puzzled, as though he wasn't sure it had warranted thanks, and went back to his cart. What happened next arrived from a direction Eleanor had not been watching. Richard Kane had been the vice president of corporate development at Gray Holdings for 6 years. And in those 6 years, he had developed a comprehensive and carefully managed resentment toward Eleanor that was, in its construction, almost architectural, each grievance laid precisely atop the previous one to form something load-bearing. He had expected, when William Gray died, to assume a significantly elevated position in the company's new structure. He had not expected William's daughter to take the wheel with such immediate and confident authority, and he had spent the years since in a posture of strategic patience that was gradually giving way to something less controlled. He was intelligent and politically skilled and deeply, sincerely convinced of his own importance, which is a combination that tends to become dangerous when its expectations are persistently thwarted. He had noticed, as such people notice everything relevant to their interests, that Eleanor was lingering in conversations with a member of the cleaning staff. He did not understand this, and therefore assigned it the most threatening interpretation available to him. She was gathering information, perhaps even preparing a loyalty audit of the executive team, using the cleaning staff as unwitting intelligence sources. This was, in fact, not what she was doing, but Richard Kane had a talent for being correct about the category of threat someone was doing something that would ultimately cost him, while being entirely wrong about its specifics. He began, with measured care, to construct a problem. The accusation appeared first as a concern raised through anonymous channels. A night shift employee had been observed accessing executive-level files after hours. The concern was logged with HR and escalated to legal, in the careful bureaucratic choreography that Richard Kane had spent years perfecting. Documents were cited. Specific dates and times were provided. A photograph of uncertain origin appeared in the file, showing a man in a gray uniform in proximity to an open desk drawer. Within a week, Jason Price was placed on administrative suspension pending investigation, and the announcement of this suspension, made in the morning briefing of the operations team, produced exactly the kind of low murmur of judgment that Richard Kane had anticipated people who knew nothing about the man or the situation concluding, because suspension implies guilt, regardless of what the accompanying language specifies, that the janitor had proven to be exactly what people in his position were presumably prone to being. Jason received the notice by phone on a Tuesday afternoon, while he was between a hardware store errand and Lily's school pickup. He stood on the sidewalk and read the message twice, and then stood very still for a moment, and then put his phone in his pocket and went to get Lily, because Lily needed to be gotten, and the alternative was not standing on a sidewalk, and also the alternative was unacceptable. He had not stolen anything. He had not accessed anything. He had no idea what evidence existed or had been fabricated, and he had no resources to contest either. He had been here before, not this specifically, but in the general territory of being the person with the least structural power in a situation designed by someone with significantly more. He knew how it ended for people like him, more often than not. He went to get Lily. Eleanor found out within the hour. She reviewed the documentation that evening with the controlled fury of someone who has spent years cataloging the difference between actual evidence and the performance of evidence, and what she found was thin in ways that only appeared substantial if you were not paying the kind of attention she was capable of paying. The photographs were time-stamped inconsistently. The file access logs had been altered not obviously, but the metadata didn't hold together under serious scrutiny. The witness account, traced back to its origin point, led to a single source who reported directly to Richard Kane and had received a discretionary bonus 6 weeks prior. Eleanor sat with this material and felt something she recognized from early in her tenure. A specific clarifying anger that burned off sentiment and left only resolution. She called Patricia. She asked for everything that existed on Richard Kane's use of corporate systems in the past 90 days. She asked for the complete camera archive from the executive floor for the same period. She asked for these things with a quietness that Patricia understood immediately was more serious than any elevated tone would have been. Patricia said she would have it by morning. Eleanor said she needed it by 9. Patricia said she would have it by 9. The emergency board meeting convened at 10 o'clock on a Thursday with Richard Kane present, which was important because Eleanor needed him there to see what she had. She presented her findings with the same methodical precision she brought to quarterly earnings reviews. No flourishes, no apparent emotion. The documentation speaking for itself and speaking loudly. The camera footage of Richard Kane directing his assistant to modify the access logs. The text message thread recovered from the corporate server confirming the coordination of the witness account. The bonus payment dated 2 days after the initial complaint was filed. The actual camera footage from the executive floor on every date cited in the accusation, showing Jason Price in the corridors with his cart, cleaning, and nothing else. Richard Kane did not speak during most of this presentation. When Eleanor was finished, she looked at him for a moment, with an expression that contained nothing performative. No satisfaction, no cruelty, only the flat acknowledgement of a person who has been proven right about something she wished she had been wrong about. Then she asked the board to confirm the termination of his employment, effective immediately, which they did, and Richard Kane left the building that afternoon with his personal items in a box that was too large for what he actually had, which was a detail that Eleanor, who noticed everything, noticed. She went to Jason's apartment the following evening. She had his address. She stood at his door and knocked and waited, and when he opened it, he was in a plain t-shirt, and the look on his face when he saw her was not recognition. He still did not know who she was, but a kind of polite wariness that she understood was the appropriate response to having a stranger knock at your door after a difficult week. She asked if she could come in. He said yes, because he was the kind of person who said yes to that. The apartment was small and clean, and showed the marks of 2 people living carefully within it. Lily's drawings on the refrigerator, a stack of library books on the coffee table, a single plant on the windowsill that was thriving despite everything, which seemed correct. She sat in the chair he offered her, which was the better of the two in the room, and she took the jacket out of the bag she was carrying and put it on the table between them, folded. He looked at it. He looked at her. She watched the understanding move across his face, slow at first, then gathering as he connected the jacket to the CEO's office to the woman sitting across from him. She told him everything: the test, the camera, the jacket, the footage she had watched and rewatched at midnight while the building was empty. She told him about Patricia's file and the park on Saturday and the yellow coat and the laugh that she had heard from across a park bench and had not been able to forget. She told him that she had allowed Richard Kane's accusation to reach the point it reached because she had needed to be certain about the evidence before she moved, and that she was sorry for the week he had spent suspended and that she would make it right in every way available to her. She told him that she was the CEO of Gray Holdings, and that she had spent 3 years doubting whether any person on earth was capable of a gesture entirely free of self-interest, and that he had proven her wrong in an empty office at midnight, with a jacket worth approximately $40 and a cup of warm water. She said this last part very quietly. Her voice held through most of it, and then did not, and she did not apologize for that either. Jason was quiet for a long time after she finished. He looked at the jacket on the table. He looked out the window that faced the street. He had the expression of a man processing multiple things simultaneously: surprise, certainly, and some complicated version of self-consciousness at having been observed in a private moment, and something else that took Eleanor a moment to identify, which was a kind of exhausted relief, the relief of being seen accurately by someone who had the capacity to understand what they were seeing. He said he hadn't done it to impress anyone. She said she knew. He said he had only done it because she looked cold and tired and it seemed like the obvious thing to do. She said that was exactly it. That was precisely the thing. He said he wasn't sure what any of this meant for his job. She said his job was his for as long as he wanted it, but that she had also been looking at his engineering file, and that Gray Holdings had a technical operations department that was in the process of restructuring, and that if he was interested, she would like him to meet with the director there. He looked at her for a long moment. He said he would think about it. She said that was fair. She stood to leave, and he stood too. And she picked up the jacket and held it out to him, and he took it, and their hands were both on it for a moment before she let go. And neither of them said anything about that. At the door, she turned and said one more thing, which was that the person who had the most consistently difficult time in her life was not the one with the most to lose, but the one who had learned that helping was dangerous, and that she had spent a long time being that person, and that an old jacket on a cold night had gone some way toward reminding her that it didn't have to be permanent. He said goodnight. She said goodnight. She walked to her car in the dark and sat in it for a long time before she started the engine. The year that followed was not simple and was not without friction, because nothing real ever is. Jason accepted the position in technical operations and proved, within the first 3 months, that the personnel file had not overstated his capabilities. He had a quality of practical intelligence that was difficult to train and impossible to fake, and the team around him noticed it before he seemed to notice it himself. He enrolled Lily in an after-school program that she took to with the enthusiasm of a child who has always been capable of more than her circumstances had offered her, and she began bringing home drawings of engineering equipment that she explained to Jason in elaborate detail, and that he received with an attention so genuine it was almost reverential. Eleanor began appearing in contexts that were not strictly professional: a company philanthropy event where she lingered near the table where Jason was sitting, a departmental lunch where they ended up beside each other by an arrangement that was technically accidental. They were careful with each other in the way of people who have both been hurt enough to know that carefulness is not cowardice. They talked in the way they had talked in the corridor at midnight, without performance, without strategy. And the talking became a thing they both found themselves looking for in the mornings before the day filled up with everything else. Lily met Eleanor at a company family day event and examined her with the frank thoroughness of an 8-year-old who has learned to form her own assessments, and then, apparently satisfied with whatever the assessment produced, climbed into the chair beside her and began explaining the structural properties of the climbing equipment in the company courtyard, which Eleanor listened to with complete attention. Because she had learned from the father. The proposal happened at the end-of-year philanthropy gala, which Eleanor had organized to benefit the city's public school technical education programs, a cause she had embraced in the months since she had begun paying different kinds of attention to the world outside her 42nd floor. The room was full of people who knew Eleanor Gray as a composed and formidable woman, people who had spent years calibrating their own behavior in her presence, the way you calibrate behavior in the presence of anyone who holds significant power over your professional life. They were accustomed to watching her work an event the way she worked, everything with precise attention and minimal wasted motion, acknowledging the right people in the right order, saying what needed to be said, and not significantly more. What they were not accustomed to, and what several of them would reference for years afterward, in conversations that always began with the phrase, "Do you remember the gala?" was what happened 40 minutes into the evening program. Jason stood up in the middle of the speeches quietly, without announcement, with the same unhurried deliberateness with which he had crossed an empty office at midnight and walked to where Eleanor was standing near the stage, and said something to her in a low voice that the 150 people in the room could not hear, but could watch the effect of, which was that Eleanor Gray, who had the reputation of a woman impervious to surprise, went very still and then pressed both hands briefly over her mouth and then laughed, which was a sound that several people in that room would later say they had never heard from her before, and which was, by all accounts, entirely worth the wait. He was holding a ring that had belonged to Diane's grandmother, which Diane had asked him to keep for Lily someday, and which Lily had, with solemn 8-year-old ceremony, given him her explicit blessing to offer to Eleanor, because Lily had decided, as children sometimes decide with a clarity that adults spend years trying to recover, that Eleanor was good, and that goodness deserved to stay. Eleanor said yes. The room applauded with the particular enthusiasm of people who have witnessed something genuinely true in a setting designed for performance, and the sound of it rose up to the high ceiling of the event space and stayed there. The moment that surpassed even this came later, at the edge of the evening, when the formal program had concluded and people were moving through the room in the loose, convivial way of events winding down. Lily, who had been allowed to attend for the first hour in a green dress she had chosen herself after extended deliberation, was sitting on a chair near the dessert table, working through a slice of cake with focused dedication, when she looked up and saw Eleanor approaching. She slid off the chair and crossed the small distance between them in 3 steps, and wrapped both arms around Eleanor's waist, with the full-bodied commitment of a child who hugs the way she does everything without reservation, without calculation, with her whole self invested in the action. Eleanor, whose arms had learned in the past year to return these gestures in kind, held her. And Lily looked up from within the hug and said, in the direct and careful way she said things she had clearly been thinking about for some time, "Can I call you Mom?" Not a question, quite. Not a statement. Something in between, offered in the way you offer something you have been holding for a while and have decided, finally, is safe to give. Eleanor tightened her arms around the child and could not speak for a moment. When she could, she said yes. Just that. One word, which was sufficient, and which contained everything she had been unable to say for years about belonging to someone and having someone belong to you in return. Jason was standing nearby and saw it happen and turned to look at the window across the room, at the city dark outside the glass, and breathed very slowly for a moment, and if there were tears he did not draw attention to them, which was consistent with who he was. Later that night, after the gala, and after Lily had been collected from Mrs. Ellison's and had fallen asleep in her own bed, with the turtle backpack leaning against the wall and the library books stacked on the nightstand, Jason and Eleanor sat at the kitchen table of the small apartment, with cups of tea that had gone slightly cold, and Eleanor looked at the plant on the windowsill still thriving, still entirely itself, and thought about the distance between a woman who tests people because she cannot believe in them, and a woman who says yes to a man who once gave her his coat in the dark, without expecting anything back. The distance was not as great as she would have predicted. It turned out that trust, once located, was not so much a bridge as a door, not something you build gradually across an impossible span, but something that opens when you finally stop being afraid of what's on the other side. She had been afraid for a very long time. The fear had been reasonable. The fear had served its purpose. And now, in a small kitchen in a building that needed new sidewalks outside, with cold tea and a sleeping child in the next room, and a man who had a safety pin on his jacket, and an extraordinary capacity for simple human decency, Eleanor Gray put the fear down. She put it down very gently, as though it had been real and had mattered, which it had. And she left it there. Sometimes, the thing that heals a broken heart is not wealth or power, or the correct sequence of strategic decisions. Sometimes, it is a worn-out jacket draped over cold shoulders by someone who asked for nothing, expected nothing, and understood, in the uncomplicated way of people who live close to what is real, that kindness offered without calculation is not weakness. It is the only form of strength that lasts.